I am going to talk to you today and hopefully tell you a little bit of a story about an issue that I have been working on for more than 20 years now, and this is what I really think is the fundamental issue of trying to accurately assess intimate partner violence so that we really have the right numbers for planning policy and prevention and intervention and everything else that we do. I like to sort of step back, like way back, and just take a minute to think about how much we have really accomplished as a group in the last half century or so. Because if you go back to the earliest recorded history, there is violence all through it and all in it. And I really, especially in these last few weeks when we are, being hit even more, with the tragedies in Paris and today the hostage situation in Mali, there's been acts of violence like we're facing today for millennia, for as long as we know. I always, in my history, I always like to point out Henry VIII, my favorite serial killer and batterer. But for many years, and if you read these ancient histories or these poetries or you look at these artistic depictions, it was just all treated as this sort of inevitable fact of life. It was an important part of what was going on, but it was never really presented in a way like something could be done about it and something could be stopped about it. And even in terms of the type of thing that we focus on in family violence, even to understanding what a fundamental social problem this is. And so if you go back, this started to change about 100 years ago. And people started to say, maybe we shouldn't sort of, turn our way from violence in the family. The first child protection case happened. There were laws that began to limit or abolish the right to beat your wife. But even in these early days, the social science literature was really just getting started. And even with something like the discovery of child abuse, quote unquote, by the medical establishment, they still really thought of this as a rare and deviant phenomenon that only happened in the most crazy and disturbed families. So for example, with regard to child sexual abuse, I think is one of the most dramatic examples. You can go look at medical school textbooks as recently as the 1970s, and you'll see estimates of something like sexual abuse affecting 1 in a million children. So in the United States, there's about 73 million children. That would mean that there are only 73 victims of child sexual abuse in the entire country. They still, even when they started to recognize it in emergency rooms and settings like that, they didn't realize how pervasive it was as a public health problem. So even in these early days, and these people all kind of fight over who gets to be claimed first as the first shelter for battered women, but even then it was still really thought of as this rare and deviant act. That started to change in the 1960s. And in fact, I really think that Alfred Kinsey probably deserves a lot of the credit for understanding what you could do in terms of survey research. So still, one of the most common questions that I get when I give talks is well, who would tell you about that? Who would admit to that? But it turned out, even in his research in the 1940s, when he did research not only on sexual behavior, but as some of you might know, he also studied pedophilia and was probably the first really systematic study of pedophilia, that if you promise people confidentiality and anonymity, that they will really, in fact, tell you a lot of stuff about the most intimate and personal details about their life. Of course, we think about that with respect to violence, but it's not just true about violence. It's true about illegal drug use. It's true about stigmatized sexual behaviors like same-sex sexual behaviors. It's true about stigmatized medical statuses, such as being HIV positive or having had an abortion. It's true about engaging in criminal and delinquent behavior. And so starting in the middle of the 20th century, there was this real revolution. In terms of crime, the National Crime Survey in the United States, and then shortly afterward a number of similar ones in Canada and Britain and elsewhere, started to establish that people would also tell you about their criminal behavior. And it was really Murray Strauss and Rich Gellis and Suzanne Steinmetz, though, who first put this together and discovered that in the survey research context that people would also tell you about violence even in their most important intimate and family relationships. This is them, and as is famously known in the data, not just of course in the States now, but in Canada and all across the world, we know that the numbers are more like 1 in 10 for intimate partner violence in a lot of communities. And depending on how you look at other types of violence, some forms such as sibling violence and things like that are even more common. But what happened back in 1975, equally famously, is that the first survey studies that came out introduced the dilemma that I want to spend most of today talking about, and this is the issue of what the gender patterns in violence were. And so what happened is that we have a lot of indicators of violence, and most of them they all have their differences and they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but most of them give a pretty similar estimate. And I think an analogy would be to step on a scale. I like to tell a story that a long time ago I had a scale that always told me that I weighed 7 pounds, so about 3 kilograms less than what I actually weighed. And I kept that scale for a really long time because I really liked that scale. And I knew that if I went to the doctor's office or to the gym or something like that, that I was going to get a different weight, and I knew for a long time that it was not giving me the right weight. It gave me the same weight very consistently. Every single solitary time I stepped on that scale, it gave me the good news that I weighed 7 pounds less than I thought that I did. But because it gave me that weight, it doesn't mean that I should just now go with that and I should think that that's what the accurate weight is. But that is basically what happened when the conflict tactics scale first came out, is that they said, no, all of these other measures are wrong. This is the one that you should pay attention to. And what a lot of people don't realize when they think about this issue is that this multi-method divergence is a lot more extensive than is often recognized when people talk about this debate. Because we have many, many types of indicators of intimate partner violence. So, for example, there's IP homicide. This is not as obvious, I hope it's obvious, this is not survey research, right? We are not talking to victims. And so there are limitations with homicide data. People still think there's probably, that there are undiscovered bodies, for example, out there. But for the most part, in the field of criminology, this is usually considered some of the best data that are out there, because in countries like Canada and the United States, there are really not a lot of dead bodies lying around that have not been identified in the criminal justice system. And those data never show gender symmetry, depending on, they tend to show about 3 or 4 female victims for every male victim. Arrest data are another type of data, which was what the police do, and they also have never found gender symmetry in arrest data. Reports to the police are actually quite different than arrest data, even though in the United States we have mandatory arrest laws in many of our states. We have some recent data from the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence that still shows that only about 60% of domestic violence perpetrators are called after the incident is reported to the police. So this is two different types of outside judgment. So this is the police responding to a scene and going, yes, this is an incident of domestic violence. Yes, this is something that warrants a criminal justice intervention. This is the same judgment by the general public that there's something that has happened that warrants a call to the police. We have now, because in the United States we have a new system that captures reports to the police. It's called the National Incident-Based Reporting System. I mean, I use new in the loose sense of the term. For people as old as I am, it's about 10 or 15 years old, so it's new to me. But and then reports to the police are actually even a little bit less gender symmetry than arrests. They tend to be about 4 or 5 male perpetrators for every female perpetrator. If you ask other witnesses, like children or other people in the community about it, they also will never give answers indicating gender symmetry. In the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, we have a number of questions on exposure to intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and in that we get about 2 to 3 male perpetrators for every female perpetrator. The other thing that you can tell in our incident data from the way that we do that survey that you can't tell on the CTS and a number of other instruments is that there's no indication that most of these children are identifying both of the parents as the perpetrator. So there's this whole mutual violence. Only about 1% of the cases in NATSCEV are described as being mutually perpetrated by the child witnesses. Even perhaps more importantly than any of the foregoing are other survey formats, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more in a minute, but it's also really important to realize that there are a number of other self-report community surveys that don't produce gender symmetry. And so that is an even more, from a scientific point of view, that's an even more problematic issue than some of these other things. So you could say, as people do, that there's a lot of reasons why arrest data or something like that might not map onto the surveys. I actually think most of those reasons are not evidence-based. But it becomes even harder to say, like, why does the National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, or the Statistics Canada surveys, or the British Crime Survey, or the National Violence Against Women Survey in the United States, or the National Survey of Adolescents. I mean, really, there's a dozen other nationally representative surveys that do not show gender symmetry. And so then that becomes an even more problematic question from a methodological point of view about why would one survey show gender symmetry and another not when they're both using a nationally representative sampling frame. So the CTS, and it's not just the CTS, this is a whole class of measures, so I would include the cadre, the Conflict and Adolescent Dating Relationship Inventory by David Wolf and colleagues in this category, the Index of Spouse Abuse, in the States, Vanjie Foshi's instrument that she used in Safe Dates has gotten to be very popular. This group of surveys all have some features in common, and all of these CTS-type checklists do consistently show gender symmetry, much in the same way that my broken scale kept telling me that I was 7 pounds lighter than I really am, but they do have multi-method divergence. So when you have this phenomenon from a scientific point of view, and the main point I hope that you will take away from this is that what happened is that a lot of people went, oh my God, there's all this female perpetration that we haven't been recognizing, and kind of ran off with that. But the most important scientific question that you need to answer first about this is, why are these different? What is producing the differences? And the story that I am going to tell is really a story about for a variety of reasons, like why I think we have let 40-some years go by without really paying very much attention to that particular question. You can also, and I don't want to go into all of these in a lot of detail, but it is also true that there are no other forms of violence that show gender symmetry. So that introduces yet another question that's even different from that methodological question about why there would be a different gender pattern for intimate partner violence than there is for other types of criminal behavior. This is sometimes the one exception that you most often might hear that's different from that is the question of other family violence, of child abuse in the home. But that does not show as much gender symmetry as is commonly perceived. First of all, things like sexual abuse don't show gender symmetry no matter how you measure it. There are far more male perpetrators of child sexual offenses and molestation than there are females. In fact, that is far, far more discrepant than physical abuse. As far as physical abuse, it depends a lot, again, on which indicator that you look at. But no matter what indicator you look at, the other issue with parental abuse of a child is that in most Western countries now, is that they're what the criminologists call opportunity VIFFers. So there are many, many, many more children living in single-parent households headed by women than there are children headed in single-parent households headed by men. So a lot of times when we look at those data, we're kind of just doing that sort of leave it to beaver, mom, dad, 2 kids, intact nuclear family. But that's not the situation where most of those kids are getting abused in. Most of them are getting abused in single-parent households. And so despite the fact that there are many fewer adult males in the lives of most children, they still perpetrate about as much or more physical abuse than women do. Now, that answer can't help you unravel the question about gender symmetry and intimate partner violence, because if you and I are in a relationship, then the amount of time I spend with you is the same as the amount of time you spend with me, right? And so we have, from a criminology point of view, we have exactly equal opportunity to offend against each other. But mothers and fathers, on average, because there's so much divorce and so many births happening out of wedlock, do not have equal opportunity to offend against children. This is one of my favorite quotes from Wittgenstein. So this is something that, is also well known in the philosophical literature in terms of trying to establish validity, is that it's really important, if you put it in social science terms, is that the problem that I'm talking about here when I talk about my broken scale is that high reliability doesn't give you any information about the truth of something. And so people will say, well, it shows this result over and over again, or they'll say, well, it's the most widely used questionnaire. But those pieces of information don't give you any information about how accurate the measurement is. And in fact, this is really a very big problem in not just with regard to intimate partner violence, but with science and healthcare in general. So there are lots of things that we do, and I used to use the example of leeches, because I think do make a really good example. Probably, so I don't know what's the French word for leech. Anybody know? Unless. Yes, so people used to use that for medical treatment, right? Yes, to bleed.
You mean
they
the
saw
small worm like sloth?
What's that?
You mean the small worm-like creature?
Yes.
It's a sangsue.
Sangsue. Thank you. So people used to think that sangsue, les sangsue, would cure things like pneumonia and tuberculosis and things like that. But then some people said that that's not really fair, that was a long time ago, and now we know better, and we would never do anything like that. But so now I have some new examples of things that we still do. And so I think one that would be very familiar to anybody would be the overprescribing of antibiotics. So, for example, and it happens for really what I believe are the exact same reasons that we continue to use instruments about the conflict tactic scale without, delving into the details about, how, whether they're working or how they're working or how they compare to other things. Because when you go to a doctor or a physician and say, oh, I've got this terrible cold and I've had it for a week and it won't go away and so I think I need an antibiotic, they know that you probably don't need an antibiotic, right? They know that you probably have a virus and that if they give you penicillin or something like that, that it's not going to help you at all. But there's a lot of systemic pressure on them to do something when you go to the doctor, and so they tend to prescribe antibiotics anyway. And as a result, there are literally what they estimate in the United States of millions of inappropriate prescriptions given every year for something that they know is ineffective because of these kind of systemic pressures to perform the sort of script of going to the doctor's office and then walking away with a prescription for a medication. So it is a common problem that we have, that we sort of reach for tools because they sort of fit our conventions without necessarily really, taking a minute to describe whether they work or not. So for me, this has been very much a personal story as much as it has been a science story or a research story. And as some of you may know, I worked on the revision of the conflict tactic scale back in the 1990s. We started this in 1994. I became a postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Hampshire, working under Murray Strauss, and he had decided, so this is 20 years now about after he wrote the original CTS. There have been 20 years of critiques, some from Canadians like Holly Johnson and Walter de Kezereddy, some from the British, the Dovashes, some from Americans like Dan Saunders. There have been lots and lots of critiques at that time. And he decided that he was going to really sit down and give this a fresh look and think about redoing it, and invited me to work on this with him. And then we ended up also having Sue Boney-McCoy, who was another postdoctoral fellow in the lab at that time, and Dave Sugarman, who was a former fellow who is on the faculty at Rhode Island College. And when I reflect back on this process now, I do really want to communicate as clearly as I can that this was a really terrific process for me in a lot of ways. And it was also a process that I think was conducted with a lot of scientific integrity. We worked very hard on this. I really experienced it at the time that after a reputation that dated from before I knew him of being sort of, resistant to hearing any of those critiques, that this was really going to be a time when we sat down and really went through them. We went and got copies of all of the critiques that people talked about a lot and anything else that we could find. And we spent hours and hours and hours sitting in a conference room at the University of New Hampshire and going through, everything that Walter de Kezereddy had ever said about the CTS, or Russell Dovash or whatever, and line by line. And we made a lot of changes in it, and I really believed at the time that this was going to shift the gender patterns, that this was going to be something that changed what we got, and that I believe that. But now, and when I think about it, I also, in retrospect, first of all, I hope and that it's maybe at least a little bit true that since another 20 years have gone by, that I'm a somewhat better scientist than I was in 1994. And but more to the point, I realize now in reflecting back on this that there really were some challenges that we were encountering that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. So the conventional wisdom in a lot of the, especially the more feminist or advocacy community, was that all of these criticisms that were in all of these articles were the reason for the gender symmetry. But if you think about it from a scientific point of view, and it took me a really long time to have this perspective on it, I think it is actually really unfortunate that even in 1994, when we first sat down to do this work, that there was basically no empirical data about any of these assertions. So the idea that it was, for example, the context of conflict, or the idea that these were, that all the women were reporting on self-defense and the men were reporting on like true violence, and so like all the sort of stuff that was in there, we really didn't have any data about that. And so we didn't really have very much information to guide us. I mean, for reasons that I think are kind of historical and maybe even accidental, the debate around this had been handled more at that argumentative level and less at like a scientific level. In terms of looking back on that experience now, I think that I have recently written a longer paper on this, but I think some of the most important limitations are that we changed numerous parameters at once. So let's say that it had turned out that we had shifted the gender patterns. Well, we made literally dozens of changes in that instrument. We dropped some items, we added other items, we changed the wording of still other items and then put them back in there in the new version. As some of you might know, we added scales on injury and on sexual coercion, and we rewrote the preamble. We changed lots and lots and lots of stuff. At the time, which at the time was sort of the convention I had in my head about how to construct a measure. But if we had shifted it, we would never have been able to say which one of those was the thing that made the difference, or was there some combination of them that made the difference. So now all we can really say about that is that those provide kind of weak evidence that it may not have been any of those factors after all. So for example, like changing the preamble in the context of conflict, by in fact that wasn't even the first time that it happened, and a lot of times when it gets used, it doesn't even get used with the full preamble. People just pull the physical assault items out and stick them in some longer survey or something like that. So I feel, but that wasn't until 2006 that the CDC actually did an experiment comparing 3 different preambles, one that was kind of like the CTS, one that was more like the National Crime Victimization Survey, and one that was more like the National Violence Against Women Survey, which kind of had like a health and safety sort of context. And they didn't find any differences about the preamble at all. So we could have experimentally ruled out a lot of that stuff, but we didn't take that approach. There are some other issues that I don't think necessarily affect the gender patterns per se, but just in terms of sort of modeling, being able to look back at one's own work and being able to critique it and be able to envision that it's not perfect and that there might be some other, improvements that could be done. I think one of the biggest limitations of what we did, and this is really, as much my fault as anybody's, is that our sexual coercion scale is limited to acts of intercourse. It doesn't have other kinds of non-consensual touching or kissing or groping or anything like that. And so, that's another sort of obvious limitation. As I look back on it now, 20 years later, I do see some strengths. I think certainly we were one of the first to really get rid of this like husband and wife terminology and to make it more gender neutral so that it would apply to same-sex relationships and it would apply to cohabiting couples as well as married couples. And so that's something I'm still very proud of, that I think that we were one of the earlier people to do that. And I do think that the wording on many of the items was improved. But it's also important to realize that this whole idea that we seem to kind of implicitly have without thinking about it, that there's going to be one scale that's going to be the perfect scale for every use, I think is also really problematic, and one of the reasons why our data on domestic violence is still not very good in a lot of ways. So for example, we did this on purpose. I mean, we sat down and we had conversations about, should we include items about children? Should we include items about pets? Their use in the original CTS, as some of you may know, there was an item on gun violence, and we took that out of the revised conflict tactics scale. Those were all conscious decisions that we made at the time, and the reason that we made them at the time, as you might be able to guess, is that not everybody has a pet, right? And so when you're trying to score a questionnaire, that if you have some items that are like not applicable because you don't have a pet, it becomes complicated to figure out like how to integrate that with the other items. So you're all nodding like, yeah, it would be a pain, right? It would totally be a pain. But the problem with that is that by excluding things like, harming pets and harming children and stuff like that, is that we eliminated a lot of the most severe acts that happen in a lot of battering relationships. Samples of women who have gone to shelter suggest that about half of them have had their pets threatened, and about a quarter of them have actually had their pets harmed. So we're missing important aspects of severe forms of domestic violence with these types of screeners. And so, for example, this doesn't, again, just apply to the CTS, but in the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, which is the biggest project that I've been working on for about the past 15 years or so, our goal with that is to do this comprehensive epidemiology of child victimization. So we have lots and lots of questions in there that we know are going to be very rare in the general public. We have questions about kidnapping, we have questions about exposure to riots, we have questions about sexual abuse by known adults, and the reason for that is because we're trying to do this very large survey that really helps track, even though those are rare, those are important offenses from a criminal justice point of view and a policy and child welfare point of view. But right now, I just recently was in the field in a community survey with a smaller sample, and we wanted a measure of polyvictimization, but we were not trying to do that sort of same comprehensive epidemiology. So we cut a lot of those questions because they're difficult questions. They add a lot of time and sensitivity to the survey, and they won't actually help us very much with our research questions. I did just want to give a shout out with the specifics of that to Holly Johnson and the Statistics Canada team. I think that they are probably the first to publish what I now think is probably the most important issue that has not been focused on sufficiently in trying to measure domestic violence research. Because they realized early on from some of their piloting and focus groups that some people, when you talked about like throwing things and stuff like that, were giving answers about pillow fights. I can tell you from my own experience that I've had that issue come up a lot with administering the CTS, that whether or not they want to know about pillow fights. Another one, for example, that came up is one time is that somebody had been in a ski accident and her partner had lost control going downhill together and crashed into her, and she was mad about it, I think, she obviously thought that he should have, paid more attention or whatever, but that's not domestic violence, right? I mean, you lose control on the ski slope and you run into your wife, well, that's a bummer, but it's not domestic violence, and so those are the sorts of things that we're having a hard time discriminating with, I think. And so we did change that into CTS2, and this is a quote from the original article, by Murray and the rest of us. And so I think that these are probably the very first official efforts to address this issue about false positives. So I want to come back to this about differences. So one of the big hypotheses that Murray has put forth and also that Michael Johnson has put forth are basically hypotheses about the sampling frame. So if you know Michael Johnson's typology about situational couple violence and intimate terrorism, he keeps changing the names, but so I think that it is absolutely true that there are different subtypes of violence and that there are different types of involvement with that, but it's not very well appreciated or what Murray calls it is the representative sample fallacy. Those hypotheses don't address the issue that there are a lot of surveys that don't produce gender symmetry. So it doesn't explain why the epidemiological catchment area survey or the national crime victimization survey, because those are also using very similar nationally representative sampling frames. So there's no reason why you would think that they would be capturing intimate terrorism in higher proportions than the National Family Violence Survey does or some other survey that has done that. So that is really not that's not going to help us, basically. There are other ones, so like self-defense. This is another area that has really received surprisingly little study, and most of what's out there is so poorly done that we probably can't really draw very many conclusions from it. So it varies a little bit, and in the United States, I don't know if you've heard about these stand your ground laws and things like that, where they're actually making it easier to shoot people if you think that they are perpetrating even like a property crime against you, which is a really radical sort of redefinition of several hundred years of common law understanding about what self-defense is. But if you take the sort of what was for the first, 500 or 600 years of jurisprudence, like the standard idea about what self-defense is it requires that the threat be immediate. It requires that there not be an alternative to escape. There are sometimes exceptions, castle defense exceptions, about not having to leave your own home, and it also requires that your action be in proportion to the threat experience. So historically, so now in Florida, for example, if you come home and you find some kid stealing a bike out of your garage, legally, you can shoot that kid, I know it's horrifying, but it's really horrifying. But historically, you would not have been able to do that because that would not be considered a proportionate response. That's not a life-threatening action against you, and so you can't respond with lethal force if you're not being threatened with potentially lethal force. So I think most of the research that's been done on that, almost none of that tries to explain it to respondents in any way or tries to unpack the sort of legal complexities behind it. However, even despite all of that, I think that the self-defense argument is probably just flat out wrong anyway. And the reason for that is, and we will get into this more in a minute, but the reason for that is because those are really focusing, it's the same problem we have with so much of the work that we do, is that we tend to focus on these stereotypical extreme events. So it's kind of analogous to the problem in the rape literature about the go-to kind of example that comes to everybody's mind is some guy jumping out of the bushes in the middle of the night wielding a knife. But that's not what rape looks like, right? That's hardly ever what rape looks like. And so the problem that we have with our measure of the intimate partner violence is that we also tend to come up with this sort of burning bed, what's love got to do with it, sort of extreme stereotypes about battering, where self-defense does legitimately come into play. And of course that is a big problem, and it does affect hundreds of women a year. But when you're talking about these community surveys, it's not very likely that any of the women or any of the men in there are going to have had, or more than a handful, are going to have had experiences that meet that historical definition of self-defense. So we're kind of focusing on the wrong side of the issue when we're pointing to things like that. I'm not going to have time to go into them today because I am actually going to solve all these problems for you that I'm laying out here. I know the answer, though the answer is coming, but so we're not going to be able to go into like all of the different issues today. But there are all these things about context and initiation and all that sort of stuff. Those are not going to get the job done either. There's no real evidence that most of those old ideas that date from the critiques of the 70s and 80s and 90s really have much to do with the measurement problem. So, after the CT, so when we got the data back, and nothing had really shifted, right? So I always try to put yourself in my shoes and imagine, like, we are working really hard. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I have experience working with, battered women in lots of different settings. I was like, this is gonna clean it up. We've got the sexual courage, and it's gonna be better. It's gonna be awesome. And it didn't look that different. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that and just basically. And I think that what some people's conclusions from that was that, well, we're done. So, the CTS, this is perfect. We changed these changes, and now we know that, that this is, in fact, the ultimate truth. But I really feel like that multi-method divergence still wasn't explained. So when we ruled out a bunch of stuff, kind of, sort of, but we still didn't understand why these data look so different from all of the other sources of data. So in the so actually what happened first for a while is that I got pregnant and had a couple babies, and I didn't work that much for a while. And so I kind of got back around to this, like later in like the mid-2000s. And the first thing I did was I wrote a couple of papers that were more of the sort of thing that I've just been talking about with you today. So these sort of conceptual and methodological critiques. They brought in a lot of literature from criminology, and and at the time I really felt, personally, I have to tell you, I really felt like I was sticking my neck out about this. I mean, obviously my name is very associated with the conflict tactics scale. This felt like a big thing to be going out with these. But really, even though a few people said some nice things about them to me, they didn't really have very much impact on the field. They've been cited a little bit, but they have literally been cited maybe like 1/10 as often as like the conflict tactics scale paper, which is still easily, far and away, my best known and most highly cited paper. And I realized that I was going about this the wrong way. And so my new hypothesis I call the birds gotta fly, fish gotta swim hypothesis, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. And because I realized that everybody has the exact same problem that physician in his exam or her examining room has, is that you're sitting there enacting the script of going to the doctor and telling the doctor that you feel really terrible, and the doctor now needs to do something. And the reason I believe that they keep prescribing antibiotics over and over again is because they don't really have an alternative. And so, what I've spent the last several years doing is basically trying to solve that problem of giving people something else that they can plug into survey research, because I do believe that survey research can tell you things that these other indicators cannot tell, and making it possible for people to, and then by extension also answering the question about what's different across these different measures. So as it happened, I spent 2004 on a semester abroad trip. I was just die Frau, actually. My husband was the official chaperone for a group of students, and it was the first time in a long time that I had been around college students in such an up close and personal way. And because most of the time I interact with them in a very setting that's very much like what we're having here, and really just like all of you all today, they really behave themselves quite nicely in this setting. They don't act out, they don't goof off, they don't horse around, they don't sit quite as still as you all are sitting, but they manage to sit pretty still and not be too disruptive. And so in this situation, we stayed in this castle in the Tyrolean part of Italy. It was lovely, and they stayed in this farmhouse here, and we were taking a lot of meals with them, and we were going on a lot of tours with them, and we were traveling and getting stuck in airports and all that sort of stuff. And that was just way beyond their impulse control. So that like totally taxed it out. And they hit each other constantly. I mean, that was like my takeaway message from like being around them, and I'd sort of forgotten about like how much horsing around there is and how much wrestling and horseplay. And then one day, this program was run by Ezra Pound's daughter, the poet, Mary Durakovic, and who married some like minor Romanian aristocrat or something like that. And that's how she ended up in this castle. And she would serve tea for us every Sunday in her apartment in the castle in the afternoon. It was lovely. And her idea about like the proper way to spend your Sunday afternoon was like read aloud from poetry and listen to classical music. And so they were supposed to dress for this, and it was very dignified and everything. And so we're all sitting there one day, and she's, reading aloud from her own poetry. And about 10 or 15 minutes late, this young woman comes rushing in, and with 3 of the young men following closely behind her, including the one that she was dating at the time, which had sort of started, as they so often do, like actually on this study abroad trip. And it turned out that it was her 19th birthday, and that those 3 young men had given her 19 spankings for her 19th birthday. But they were laughing about it and joking, and it was a small group of students. There were only 10 of them, and that was 3 of the 5 guys in the group. And this young woman had, I think, but from my guess, when the perspective of the other women, is that she had already been managing to monopolize like a fair amount of the attention of the 3 more attractive guys in the group, and so she came in and she's like laughing. She's the one that tells this story. Oh, they just spanked me 19 times and ha ha ha, and then the boys were all like, yeah, that's right, we spanked her 19 times, and the other young women in the room, far from sort of responding in this way, like, oh my God, you've been beat up, they looked jealous, they looked upset, and I think that what was happening, among a lot of other things, is that I think that this was a way that they were expressing a lot of sexual attention. I think it was a way that they were, expressing a lot of poor impulse control. I think that there was some competition for this girl's affections between the one that she was sort of nominally going out with at the time and the other 2. And not to say, as a mother of a 15-year-old daughter, I'm not endorsing any of that, okay? I'm against adolescent sexual tension, but I also, and I'm sitting there, so I'm sitting in this lovely castle in Italy, as a count's daughter is like reading her poetry, and all I'm thinking is like, I wonder how she would answer the CTS2 right now, So, I think what happens is that the way that the CTS2 is worded, and the cadre, and the index of spouse abuse, and all the rest of these things, is that they don't necessarily make any effort whatsoever to discriminate between those types of behaviors, which are not, noble, or, not, something that we're going to, like, hold up and go, try to be like this, but I also think are a fairly normative part of adolescence and the establishing of, romantic, relationships, and that that's not what people normally mean when they think of as teen dating violence, and I think that we should be careful about labeling those kinds of behaviors as violence. I think if you start to think about it from that point of view, that in fact that violence is a very fuzzy concept, that we don't do enough to understand what it means and what it doesn't mean. My favorite example of a fuzzy concept is Pluto. Probably all of you know the very sad story about Pluto, right? So for decades, Pluto had the status of a planet, and he hung with the big kids, and he was a full-size planet, and he had been given a name on purpose to like appeal to kids, so he was every kid's favorite planet. And then they found Eris, an even bigger, basically, rock, that was even further out in Pluto, and what they now, think of as just one of the asteroids in that larger Kuiper belt. And so, believe it or not, I had to look this up, but believe it or not, they did not officially, scientifically define planet until 2006. And when they did define planet, and they had a big vote with their physics union and everything, Pluto got knocked off the list, because Pluto is really just one of the bigger rocks in an asteroid belt. It's not really a planet in what you would normally, it's like something with a fairly regular orbit around a star type of definition. And so people are still very upset about that. But I think it's a good example. I think it's it can help illuminate the problem that we have with violence. So to go back to my scale problem, I told this story. I told that story at UNH about my broken scale. And somebody who shall remain nameless came up to me afterward, and it wasn't Murray, but he's like, how do you know that your scale's not the right scale, and that all the other scales are the broken ones, and that the one at the doctor's office and the gym and everything are broken in exactly the same way, and they just happen to all give the incorrect one, and I have the only functional scale. And that is actually a very good question. It's an important scientific question. I don't know if it was asked with the exactly a perfect scientific attitude, but it is an important scientific question. Because what if my scale is the only scale that has the right answer and all those other scales are wrong? And the only way that you can know that is you have to know what the definition of a pound is, or a kilogram, or whatever, and that and there's an agreed upon, just like they finally agreed upon. Planets are one of the first. Our earliest scientists, this is what they were doing. They were looking up into the heavens and seeing planets, right? This is such old science. But when they came up with a specific definition of a planet, now they know which rocks are planets and which rocks are not, and which giant gaseous ball. A lot of our quote-unquote planets are not even planets in the way that a kid thinks about it, right? They don't even have any landmass. And violence is like that too. We can't just say that just because you touch somebody else that it's violence. We touch each other all the time, especially you Canadians. You're always kissing and greeting thing, and you have to be able to tell the difference between a hug and a hit, and you have to know what that is. And right, sometimes it's a gray area. It's not easy to do, but there are lots of things that we do that if you think about your average Martian or whatever, that they might not have an easy time telling this. So even something that's obviously socially normative, like being cut open by a surgeon. So why do you think that a stabbing is a stabbing and an operation is an operation? If you want to be a behavioral scientist, you have to be able to answer that question. Getting tackled in a football game, why don't we arrest the linebackers and the tight ends at the end of the football game? What's different about a football game and an act of domestic violence? Getting jostled in a crowd, anybody get on a subway, pretend fighting by actors or stuntmen. Oh, there was a heartbreaking story in the news just a few days ago about a hit-and-run accident where some 11-year-old boy who ended up dying shoved his younger sister out of the way just in the nick of time. She got thrown. Yeah. Okay. Fast. We didn't start at 9:30, but I will speed up. Anyway, there are a lot of things. And so I think what the answer to this problem is that a lot of these indicators that we've been talking about actually do go to a fair amount of trouble to clean up false positives. So there might be some situations with something like the National Crime Victimization Survey or homicide data, but we're not really looking at a dead body and going, I mean, the only false positive you would get is if that person really wasn't a homicide victim, and so we go to a lot of trouble to make sure that we're not mislabeling those types of things. But in the CTS and things like that, there's no attention to that boundary issue at all. And so I'm just going to go through pretty quickly, a few examples. So here's something I think is just show you where I don't want you to try to read this. Obviously, you can't read this. But this is from NatScab, and this is our fear ratings ranked by male scores. And I just want you to look down here. This is dating violence in the yellow. This is the 40-some-odd types of victimization that we measure in NatScab. And this is where our dating violence screener, which I don't think works in NatScab, comes out on fear. The only thing that it comes out as lower on our fear scale is sexual misconduct, which most of them don't even think of as a victimization at all. So like statutory rape or sexual relationships with an older male. Here's the same list for the girls. You can see it jumps up and is now one of the scariest events in our whole survey in terms of the girls' ratings. And what a lot of people say about fear is another one of those situations that doesn't solve that problem of trying to explain the differences, because contrary to what people think, there are not as huge gender differences in the fear responses to victimization as you might think. So this is they're zooming in at the top of those charts. This is the most scary stuff that happens to adolescent boys and girls. And you can see that most of the rank ordering is very similar. Sexual assaults are at the top. Exposure to domestic violence is at the top for boys and girls. War is, not surprisingly, even though it's rare when they get exposed to it, that's one of the scariest things. Interesting, there's a lot of fascinating stuff here. The direct abuse is actually rated as less fearful for both boys and girls than the exposure to their parents fighting. I found that fascinating. We found that a couple of times. But here, in this very top group of the most scary stuff, is dating violence for girls. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that even though so the ones that have stars by them, those are significant gender differences. So we only found significant gender differences for about half of the items. And although some of them are significant, it is important to note that they really are not that different from each other. So for example, like exposed to parent beating is a 2.8 on a 3-point scale, and for the boys it's 2.48 on that same 3-point scale. So we have a really large sample, so that's a significant difference, but they're both clearly saying that that's a pretty scary thing. They're not really going outside of the range. Many of these are even closer to that, so here's like 2.26 and 2.46 for the same item. The boys and girls really perceive these things a lot more similarly than the stereotypes would tell you. And at the bottom, you can see that they really have a lot of agreement about what the least scary stuff is, too. It's mostly the property crimes and the peer-perpetrated offenses like bullying and things like that. But for boys, dating violence is all the way down here at the bottom on a scale that goes from 1 to 3. They only get a 1.11. 89% of the boys that reported being a dating violence victim said that they weren't afraid at all. And I think it's quite likely that many of those incidents were more like the sort of horseplay and joking around that we were talking about earlier. I had my students for doing some observational research for just a class project, and this wasn't actually the main purpose of their study, but I told them to write down, and make notes about anything that was unusual. And so this is all at our college cafeteria. So it's a public space, surrounded by faculty, surrounded by staff, and this is the kind of stuff that they're doing, to each other all day long. I mean, and just horsing around. They're arm punches, chest bumps. A couple of them got bit. They're body slamming each other. And what they're doing here probably is just trying to get attention, right? They're just trying to draw attention to themselves, goof off, maybe blow off some steam. I don't think that any of these things are violence, and the reason that I don't think that any of these things are violence is that even though they're happening in front of all of these witnesses, including some of whom have statutory obligations to respond to violence on campus, nobody's even looking up for their lunch, much less like going over to, the kid that got swatted with the plate and like, oh, are you okay? Is everything fine? I mean, everybody understands that this is just joking around and horseplay. So it was with that in mind that I started doing a couple of experimental studies. And this one is based on the National Violence Against Women Survey. One thing that's different about the NVAWS compared to the CTS is that instead of asking you about whether your partner hit you, it just asks, did anybody hit you? And then in the follow-up question, it says, well, who was it? Was it your partner? Was it a stranger? Was it an acquaintance? Was it your mom? And it could be anybody. And they don't get gender symmetry, and it crossed my mind that one of the reasons why is that by asking about it in a more general sense, that you might be drawing attention to more salient episodes of actual violence, because it is not well understood, especially in the violence against women field, that men are crime victims of most types of violent crime much more than women are. There are many more assaults and robbery victims and things like that. And so if you do ask them about other perpetrators, they will often have a lot to tell you. So this is comparing the number of positive reports per number of items that they endorse for the standard CTS and then for just the non-specific one. So this is the exact same item. The only difference between the item is that in one version it says, my partner pushed me. In the version it says, someone pushed me. And you get hugely different results. Here's the severe IPV rate for the same thing. You can see here that there are really big differences. This is, more than a threefold difference in rates, depending on whether or not you use the word my partner versus the word someone, and you're not changing anything else about it. This fourfold ratio of 4 male victims to 1 female victim, it would be hard to overemphasize how discrepant that is from any other data point on violence of any kind that you're going to see anywhere. There just aren't any known categories where there are 4 times as many male victims as female victims. But this actually puts it right in the realm of a lot of U.S. data on minor assaults, which puts you at about 2 or 3 female victims for every male victim. I think that that's a very viable alternative, and I definitely think that's one that people can try. But I know from working with the Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire that people in the field still don't like things that require follow-up questions. And so to use that version, you have to have a follow-up question and go, well, if you said yes to someone, then who was the someone? And so I tried to work on a couple of other alternatives that would all have the information all in the screener. So this is a standard CTS over here. This is the CTS with an angry stem, so trying to get at more serious events by having the item prefaced, when my partner was angry, my partner pushed me. And then this one was with the not joking stem, so not including horseplay or joking around, my partner pushed me. And what you can see is every time you do the standard CTS, you get pretty much the same result. This one did not work at all, really. I mean, in fact, the only thing it seemed to do was depress the reporting for both males and females by using a more emotionally related term like angry. But the not including horseplay and joking around also puts us back into the realm of trying to, again, like aiming for that multi-method convergence instead of divergence. And so this, again, puts us in line with lots of other indicators of intimate partner violence. I tried the same thing in a sample of battered women, and basically I just want to point out that I think that in a sample of severely battered women, that it probably doesn't much matter how you ask the question, because they're just going to say yes no matter what. And so we did find, obviously, like much higher rates of endorsement. And as you can see, not only are these differences not statistically significant, but they're just so close to each other. They're as close as you're going to get, with a random assignment to group. And both for the rate and for the number of items endorsed. So I decided after doing that that I thought that the not including horseplay or joking around one was promising, and we rolled out a very short partner victimization scale. Another thing that's important to realize is that these things do not the CTS is 78 items long. At the time, that seemed like a really good thing to me, and that we were being like really thorough and comprehensive. But now, after hanging out with David Finkelhorn and Heather Turner and folks like that who do a lot of national epidemiology, now I'm just all about like how low can you go. And the thing is that many of those items are really redundant because you don't really identify new victims or new perpetrators with much longer ones. And if you carefully choose your items, you can really get pretty close to the same amount of information with a much smaller set of items. So we just went out with these 5 items. The unwanted sexual acts one did not have the preamble because, of course, any unwanted sexual act is wrong, whether it's thought to be joking or not. But what's important to show here, and I'm trying to follow Katrine's instruction not to fall off the stage, is that we got the pattern of gender differences that maps onto all those other indicators with about a 2 to 3 or 3 to 1 ratio, not only for our total score and for our poly-victimization score, but we also got significant gender differences for each and every item on this questionnaire. It did not, it was not, even some of the ones like hitting and stuff like that, we still got significant gender differences in this large community sample out in the rural South where I live. In terms of, I'm going to take just like 3 more minutes. In terms of construct validity, we can show the correlation with trauma symptoms. I think that this is the first study that actually compared whether or not the construct validity indicators were the same for males and females. Another kind of obvious step if you want to say that your measure is working accurately or equivalently accurately for males and females. These 2 numbers are not significantly different from each other, but they're very similar to the construct validity coefficients that we've gotten for the JV2 and other studies using that measure. Here's another one, exposure to domestic violence in childhood. So this one assesses the intergenerational transmission of violence. And these 2 numbers are also statistically equivalent. We do find that it's correlated as it should be with for both males and females. We have also now replicated this in an additional 665 adults. This second sample is more highly victimized than the first one, and so you do see somewhat fewer absolute differences because of their lifetime victimization rates, especially for the women, are very high. But we did, once again, get significant gender differences for every single item and for the total scale. I just think the most important takeaway message from this is that the tiniest little tweaks in the wording of these items have radical influences on what the results are, and so it's just really important that we understand how, we're survey researchers, and so the important part of survey science is understanding the parameters of your measurement. I was really excited to share with you that another research team that I didn't have anything to do with has done something very similar that just came out earlier this year. So in the CDC, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is something that they roll out to large numbers of usually tens of thousands of kids in the schools and the states every year. And they have had a question that is very much a CTS type question. It's also very similar to our NASCEV one, which I also think needs a little tweaking. And then they made a very similar change that they tried to add in a threshold. This was something that we really, I started to understand from the work with the JVQ, which I can talk about later if you want. So here's their old data. Their old data maps onto the CTS. It shows gender symmetry over and over and over again. It's just like that same broken scale. Every time they get on it, they get the same number, 10% male victims, 10% female victims, plus or minus a very small range. But then they rolled out that new item, and they also added an item on sexual intimate partner violence, which is if I had more time, I would get on that soapbox too, but I'll spare you. But and they also found that for the ones endorsing physical IPV only, for the ones endorsing sexual IPV only, for the ones that said both, and for the ones that said any, they found significant gender differences in both of those items after years and years and years of finding gender symmetry. So now their pattern looks like this. And I think what is especially important about this is that it has the exact same pattern that happened with the PBS. And I'll go back to that slide in just a second. But what you can see here is that it's not that the male score is lower. The males are still reporting about the same amount, but the female score has increased. And that is the same thing that we found here too. So that the males in the stripes, those are actually very close and not significantly different from each other. It's the female reporting that has varied across these different operationalizations. And I think that is because, you can, I think of this as a technological improvement. And so I think about it as much in the same way that you might compare like an X-ray to an MRI or a CAT scan, that you not only are detecting more of something, but you can be more precise about what information that you're getting. And so with these sorts of technological innovations, I think we can increase the sensitivity and the specificity. So I do want to end. I appreciate the indulgence with the time. The main thing that I would like to say at the end is that I think it is so important. We're scientists. And science is never about saying, okay, we're done, we don't need to know anything else, everything is good the way it is. To be a scientist means to believe that you always think that things can be better, that there's always ways that things can be improved, and that it's just absolutely essential that we find a way to honor the achievements of the past without feeling like we have to stick at that level of technological knowledge that we had in the 1970s. We don't use the same polio vaccine that Jonas Salk invented, decades ago. But that doesn't mean we're like, oh, that Jonas Salk, what a slacker he was, We still acknowledge his incredible accomplishment. And I think that the early social science on domestic violence, I mean, what could be more impactful and world-changing in terms of what it's done as far as changing intervention and prevention and the public investment that we make about it. But at the same time, I still believe, and really after the recent events of the last few days, that it's just ever more important for us to keep trying to get better, trying to better understand violence, get more accurate with our scientific attempts to study it, so that we can then translate that into more effective prevention and intervention. And then I just also want to briefly mention, we do have a bunch of materials online. The Vigor, my new safety plan, there is a French version online at my website. It's all free. We have a lot of other stuff that you can access. And we're starting a new add-on conference to the UNH one next summer, Resilience Con, and I hope that you guys will consider joining us in New Hampshire for that. And thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for your presentation.
Thanks.
The time well done. Perfect. Pour la période de questions, avant d'aller avec la période de questions, il y a quelque chose de très important qu'on n'a pas nommé lorsqu'on a fait la présentation ce matin. On a présenté Trajetvi, mais on n'a pas repositionné Trajetvi comme un projet qui s'inscrit dans la programmation du CRI-VIFF. Le CRI-VIFF qui comporte l'équipe Violence Conjugale qui est dirigée par Geneviève Lessard et la conférence de ce matin est co-organisée en partenariat entre Trajetvi et l'équipe Violence Conjugale. Donc Geneviève, moi je ne te vois pas, donc si tu peux te lever. Donc, la plupart d'entre vous la connaissez, mais on voulait souligner l'apport de Geneviève qui a été celle qui nous a recommandé chaleureusement notre conférencière de ce matin. On a à peu près un peu plus d'une demi-heure pour la période de questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions directement en anglais ou les poser en français. Et Charlotte, qui est étudiante à la maîtrise à l'Université d'Ottawa en service social, va s'asseoir près de chez lui pour lui faire la traduction si jamais vous posez vos questions en français. Donc, on a un petit peu plus d'une demi-heure. Je vous invite à vous nommer, à présenter votre organisme d'appartenance. Donc, j'ai vu qu'il y avait déjà une main levée. Oui.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a student at the University
Okay.
I'm Julia, and I'm a student with Trajetvi. And I have a question about, in your work, did you redefine what violence was?
So, I think that yes, to go back to the definition problem, I'm working on a paper on that. So I think that the best definition of violence is intentionally causing unwanted harm. And you have to really break it down in sort of the way we were talking about self-defense earlier. So the intention part is how the clumsy skier gets off, right? So he caused some harm, but he didn't mean to do it. It's very difficult, and of course one of the big focuses of criminal justice to really figure out intention, so that's quite the Pandora's box to try to open. The unwanted is the unwanted part, that solves the problem with my student and her suitors, right? So, and it also solves the problem of other types of consensual sadomasochism. I almost put this picture I saw in a store about this panties that said like "spank me, it's my birthday," and which is not my cup of tea, and perhaps not any of yours either. But for people who want to do that, it's not violence if they're consensually doing that. And then the harm threshold is also something that's complex, but that is something that we have really worked on a lot with NASCA, especially in the juvenile victimization, because it is hard both for parent-to-child violence and for peer-on-peer violence, as well as partner-to-partner violence, to really figure out what an appropriate harm threshold is. One of my favorite stories about that actually comes from our trying to measure psychological abuse by parents to children, and we were doing these focus groups, and this woman told a story about getting in an argument with her 16-year-old son about his room and what a wreck his room was, and that she called him a slob. And she was very worried that she really wanted to make sure that we were writing our questions in a way that if you call your kid a slob when they won't clean your room, that you don't get labeled an abusive parent. And, and again, that probably wasn't that woman's finest moment as a mother, but for those of us who are parents, I think probably surely that everybody can imagine that there was one time when you're just, communicated your frustration in probably a less than optimal way, and that doesn't make you an abusive parent. And and so we really do need to clean up those lines a lot. And I think that part of the problem with these questions about whether pillow fights count, which is something I've been asked a bunch of times, and things like that, is that they know us, right? They know that we're all psychologists or sociologists or social workers or whatever. They know we're getting at something, but they're not sure what we're getting at. And so it's like if we're doing research on pillow fights, then yes, they want to make sure that they get into the pillow fight club, but they're not entirely sure from our items what we're asking about. And so I think that makes a lot of them hesitant to disclose, and maybe it's just better to say no if you're not sure. The other piece that is very difficult and is missing from a lot of criminology stuff that you see in the child welfare literature is that there's this really complicated piece about social norms that you have to bring in. So, for example, in NASCEV, the one I already mentioned, the one that gives us the most problem with that is statutory rape. So the kid thinks that he or she is in love with, he's in love with his teacher, say, which is a fairly common report in our NASCEV cases. I do not think that he's in love with his teacher, and so he's saying that it's not unwanted and that it's not harmful, and I'm saying, oh, yes, it is. And so you also have to, especially if you want a definition that has the capacity to bring in some of the offenses against children, you really have to kind of wrestle with the social norm piece as well. So there's those four pieces.
Catherine Bolduc, I work at Option, which we work with men and female who has violent behavior in the family and in their couple. And I'm not sure I pretty well understood when you talk about unwanted harm, because many times when I try to question the intention of the person, whether it's a man or a woman, and the person say, for instance, well, I wanted to make her live what I felt, and I felt really, really hurt, so I wanted to hurt her, or I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to harm the person.
Yeah.
So maybe I misunderstood what you wanted to say about unwanted harm. So I just wanted
So those are two separate things. So the unwanted is that this is not some, so part of the reason that surgery is not violent is because you are consenting. You have to sign all those forms, right, that you consent to have operated on, even though that might be in many ways the biggest injury that you ever sustain in your life will be if you ever have to have some sort of, especially like abdominal surgery or something like that, right? And so that part is not unwanted. The harm, it doesn't matter. So in criminal law in most Western countries, those things do get taken into consideration as different degrees of offense. So that's the difference between manslaughter and homicide, for example, is whether or not you were trying to cause the harm that was created. They are complicated, but it wouldn't. You have to define something as an act of violence. The unwanted part is on the victim part, and the harm is sustained by the victim, but it doesn't have to be that the perpetrator, wasn't causing harm. I'm not sure I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Me, I don't understand what you're saying. No, I'm not sure I still understand.
So the example that you just gave, where the person said I wanted her to feel what I felt, so I was trying to hurt her.
Yeah.
Well, so that would be violence.
Yes.
Yes.
But it was wanted harm.
No. So the wanted part is that's. So the intention is where it comes from the perpetrator side.
Okay.
The unwanted is on the victim side.
Je réagis, mais je digère des affaires puis je réagis. Ça pose un paquet de pop-up dans ma tête, mais
on reviendra à toi après, je te voyais.
Oui, c'est toujours comme ça.
Oui, bonjour, Martine Hébert, I'm a professor at the UFAM. Very interesting conference, very enlightening. I was wondering if you have additional data looking at the response from both partners. Mm-hmm. And if you find with the new scale, you have better concordance between sustained violence and inflicted violence.
I have not done that, and since what you may have noticed, although I think it would be fantastic, and this also reminds me that one other thing that I have changed for this scale is that I am making it available on just an open access basis. So you can get it on my LifePath research site or also on ResearchGate when there's no fee to use it. So if you have couples, it would be delighted for you to do that. I have decided, so another problem that I think kind of accidentally got built into the CTS and as a result has had a big influence on the field is that we think about assessing perpetration and victimization as being the equivalent task. And in fact, those are not the equivalent tasks. And in most fields of criminology, they don't bother asking perpetrators what they did because they don't expect them to tell you the truth. And so there's a little bit of data on the domestic violence literature that shows that perpetrator reports, or like David Sugarman, for example, did a meta-analysis showing that perpetrator reports are more correlated with social desirability than victimization reports. And but if you delve into some of that concordance research even in more detail, a lot of times they just say, well, the concordance wasn't very good. And it's actually not a problem that's unique to domestic violence or partner violence. It's a problem with lots of measures of violent behavior outside of other relationships too. But if you look specifically at intimate partners, what you'll find in a lot of these studies, if they provide it at this level of detail, is that the men are underreporting their perpetration relative to female victimization more than women are underreporting their perpetration relative to male victimization. And I think that is also a problem with the false positives, and that men and a problem with the social norms, and that they're more reluctant to admit to something that might be perceived as a crime. But I am going to be working on developing a new measure of perpetration, but I'm actually expecting that to be a lot more challenging task to get people to do that. And so, for example, the crime surveys and the International Violence Against Women survey, I mean, most of the epidemiology that's done, not just for domestic violence, but for everything else, they don't ask about perpetration. And in the CTS, I'm making it sound like it's just the same thing. I think that's part of the reason that it gets miscommunicated about what you're talking about. Because things like pillow fights and horsing around and stuff like that are mutual. And so we're kind of suggesting that we're talking about something that's like a mutual phenomenon when it's not.
Est-ce que je peux demander aux gens de poser leurs questions fort? Parce que je n'ai pas du tout compris la question de Martine, mais j'ai fini par comprendre la réponse.
Il y avait Simon, puis ensuite je vous reviens.
Okay. My name is Simon Lapierre. I teach social work at the University of Ottawa. And well, thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really good and really interesting. And my question is less about measurement, but more about definition. And I'm wondering, I think the definition of violence is a little bit more complicated. And I think the way you describe it, the new thing in the province of Quebec is to use Johnson typology to define domestic violence and to include both intimate terrorism and situational purpose violence in the definition of domestic violence to inform policies and practices. And I'm wondering which is quite different from how you define domestic violence or violence at large. And I'm wondering if you have any views on that or your perspective on that.
I think that those are both intimate partner violence. I think that because most of that work has relied on the CTS or much of that work, well, it's been done on lots of different samples. I mean, some of them have been done on more criminological samples. I think that in practice that a lot of what is getting labeled as situational couple violence is probably contaminated with false positives, and that in general that the intimate terrorism is going to be less contaminated with false positives. Just like I was showing you in my sample of battered women, I mean, if you get people that are just, experienced, I mean, if they can say, so here I think that you can see on this one that on this version of the survey there were 8 questions, and you can see that the mean number of answers is to say yes to like 6 out of 8. So that's, I mean, if they've been beat up in so many different ways that they're going to be able to say yes to almost any way that you put it, that's not a very tough discrimination problem. In the situational couple violence, in most of these community surveys, the modal number of answers is only endorse one screener item and say that it happened 1 or 2 times. And so those are very close to 0. So the trick is really to discriminate the victims from the non-victims systematically. In bullying research and in delinquency research, they take a much more sophisticated view of this than we have historically in intimate partner violence research. And there's some really groovy things you can do if you get a little bit more sophisticated about we, in the domestic violence world, we think that 0 and 1 is like this line, this dark line in the sand. But that's not really probably where the line should be. The line really should be, like the 0, 1, 2, minimal to no involvement versus like the extensive involvement. So for example, in delinquency research, if you get some 16-year-old kid who says, well, I shoplifted a candy bar one time, they're not going to call that child a juvenile delinquent. You are going to have a more extensive and systematic involvement in violence to get labeled as a delinquent. And in the bullying research, one of the really groovy things that you can do if you set a more meaningful threshold is that you may know they're also very focused on the mutuality of it in that literature. I don't know how well you know it. And so they often categorize kids into 3 groups: the primarily bullies, the primarily bully victims, and the primarily victims. But to get into that bully victim category, again, they don't normally just set the threshold at a single act of, I called you a loser one time, and so now I'm a bully. And I mean, maybe, and so it usually has to be a more repetitive involvement in the situation. And what you can do if you set a more sensitive threshold like that is you can look at the difference between the bullying so even in the primarily victim group, you can say yes to 1 or 2 questions of bullying perpetration and still be labeled primarily a victim. And what they find out is if they do, because they do a lot of this really cool like social network and this more sort of the process evaluations, is they find that the bullying that the primarily victimized kids engage in is much more likely to be more reactive, it's much more likely to have defensive elements, and so you can understand, I think, some of the differences in these subtypes more meaningfully if you don't just arbitrarily say that the important distinction is between 0 and 1. And now that we're starting to use more sophisticated statistical techniques like latent class analysis, you can see this in a lot of the literature that's coming out with sexual assault, both as victim or as perpetrator, and with poly-victimization. We just recently came out with a latent class analysis, and when you sort these people statistically, the group that you might think of as the non-victims is really tends to be more like a non or minimal victim, like just one or two very minor episodes. If you do that on a statistical basis, those kids will almost always get thrown in with the non-victim group. And so I do think that situational couple violence is a mean type, and that many of these latent class analyses are producing 3 or 4 subtypes. With the really extensively involved in domestic violence, it would be like an intimate terrorist sort of situation. But then there's usually 1 or 2 middle groups that have moderate levels of involvement, and then the none to minor group.
Oui, est-ce que c'est possible de demander où on peut trouver la TVS à la page 20? C'est une méthode qui est suggérée. Où on peut trouver ce document-là?
Oh, on the very last page?
Yeah. Voilà, où on peut trouver ce document-là? Tu peux-tu lui demander ça? Oui. Il y a ici, là.
Oh, yes, you can find that here. It's at lifepathresearch.org. Or also, if you look up my name under ResearchGate, it's on there, and you can download it from there as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Some people have decided to just go ahead and start using. It's being rolled out by a few people with the perpetration version. That's exactly the same as the victimization version. To go back to what you were asking about, Martina, I don't know how that's going to work yet, but they haven't published it yet, but a few other people have used it, and I think it is actually super excited about how that's going. So a few people have some preliminary data on it.
My question is about your question.
I'm
Valérie Roy from Laval University Social Work School. Did you consider to include some psychological indicators? I see your threat, but I think of an example. I understand your context of joking, but I feel unsure about some verbal abuse, or in order to feel your partner lower or things like that. Well, for example, saying names.
So,
yes, things like that.
Yes. So those are. I do think it's important. So we ended up. We do have a slightly longer version that I think has a couple of psychological ones on it. I cut this in part just because I was having space problems in the survey I was doing, which was not primarily focused on this issue. But those things are more complicated. They're a lot harder than people realize. And the problem is that you're seeing all that through the lens of being a domestic violence researcher or social worker or whatever the case may be. So for example, youth now have tried to reclaim, have you had it on your campus, like these slut walks and things like that, if you'll pardon my language, and, and so that means something very different to them than it means to me. And, and sometimes I see the way, and even in our focus groups, one of my favorite quotes from our focus groups when we were doing the juvenile victimization questionnaire was, well, if your best friend calls you a bonehead, then you don't feel the same way about it. And so just those words are not in and of themselves hurtful. Really, the way youth talk to each other, they call each other stuff like that all the time. And so you have to know the context. And then it came up, I was just recently at we saw each other in Belfast at the European Conference on Domestic Violence. And so for NISPIS, for the CDC's new surveillance effort, they tried to do something on coercive control to try to better measure intimate terrorism. And I think that is, most of the people who have tried to do that in a gender-sensitive way have really failed quite miserably. And I think it's because, again, that those borders are a lot trickier. And so the example that I like to give about that, well, I can just give it today. So like right now, if you went to my husband and said, oh, where's Sherry? He would be like, she's in Montreal. And you could probably even go so far as to say that my husband absolutely insists on all times about knowing like what country I'm in at any given moment. And, and that if I called him up and I'm like, oh, by the way, I left the United States, I'm in Canada, he would really be angry with me. And, and I think that people don't realize that, like I said, I have a lot of experience working with battered women, and so I can tell you lots of really horrifying stories about, they make chalk marks on the back of their tires, so if they back out of the driveway, they know that they left the house while they were gone, or they monitor the odometer, and if and they know that it is 6 kilometers from your office to your house, and you go 6.5 kilometers, and they'll freak out, like, where were you, and like, what were you doing? But that's not the way we ask those questions. And the questions in the questionnaires are just like, does your husband insist on knowing where you are? Like, well, I could say that. I mean, he's like, absolutely insist on knowing that which country I'm in today. And, so we are not crafting those questions in ways that are getting at the clinical phenomena that we're trying to assess. And there's actually a lot. And so you think that about domestic violence all the time, but most of the time, I think a lot of times when people read those questions, it would almost, if I said that wasn't true about my husband, would I be saying that I'm a bad wife and I don't care about where he is or what he's doing? Because of course I care, and so I don't think that when they answer those questions, they're necessarily thinking about them the way that we do. And I think that is why you both get really, really high rates of endorsement. It looks like coercive control is like the norm in these relationships, and also that most of the time you get gender symmetry. So yeah. I think that, and I think even with this technology age that there's, one of the things I've heard about from youth quite a lot lately is that they now, like a controlling partner, will want to see photo proof of where you are. Like you said that you went to have dinner with your parents. Well, I want you to take a picture standing next to your mother and send me the picture and like prove where you are. But it's also true that because they document their lives so extensively, that you can probably find that out about pretty much anybody. And so when is that you like stalking somebody because you're like following them on Facebook, and when is that just you kind of doing what everybody's doing and just checking your Facebook several times a day to see what's going on with people? And we really need to do more work on that. So I know not just from the PBS, but also from the work we've done on the juvenile victimization questionnaire, that this particular item about threatening to hurt somebody, that is clear cut. Like, there's no nice way to do that. And, they will say things like, I'm going to kill you. But if you say, like, not including, like, joking around, then I know that one works. It doesn't just work for partner violence. It works for peer victimization, too.
Oui, Catherine a une autre question.
But it's just to respond to that. Is it possible then that violence is that complex that we cannot just appreciate violence by only questions, and that we need to go further and go on the qualitative? I don't know how you say that in English, because if we don't, it's always about context and intention, right? So the questions, they can't really assess that. When you say for instance, oh, you always want to know where the person is, where I'm worried, whereas I want to know because I cannot, I'm jealous and whatever. It's two different things, but with the questionnaire you cannot assess that.
Well, with the crummy questionnaire.
With the what?
A bad questionnaire.
Oh, okay.
Questionnaire mauvais.
But the six questions that you were showing us, the short one that you made, can you assess that?
Well, we do have some follow-up data on what we ask, because these lead to some branching questions about harm and things like that. And so I think that that's just a matter of validation, and that it absolutely is possible to really get a lot of really excellent information through questionnaires. Although I am a big fan of qualitative research and more narrative approaches, and almost everything we do is mixed methods, and so we do start there, but I am enough of a scientist that I believe that we can distill those patterns in ways that we can translate those into something that can be done in a briefer time or in a wider variety of circumstances.
Il nous reste un peu de temps pour nos deux dernières questions.
Hi, I'm Jacinthe Dion from the University of Chicoutimi. I wonder if you use the PBS with youth, with teenagers, or?
Yes, this study, well, not with the item on sexual victimization, and so the data was just with the 18s and up. There is a larger study that is using it in New Hampshire with youth. I have used it with youth, and I think that it, these data, and not just my data, but other people's data too, I think that there are more similarities between like middle and older in gender, between adolescent boys and adolescent girls. You can see that in the NIVERS data and a number of other data sources as well. And I think that the challenge about measuring teen dating violence, which is also something that I have done some work in, is really more on figuring out the dating piece of it. Because I think that when you look at like 12 and 13-year-olds, and they say that they're dating, or well, they don't really say that anymore, but they'll think about it in that sort of way, and I think that the PBS probably works best for more clearly monogamous relationships that with like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. We do have it with, there were a few hundred adolescents in here too, and so I was pretty happy with the way that turned out as well. What I would like to do, and maybe we should try thinking about something like some of the cadre items, is figuring out a way to get some sort of sexual victimization component in there that wouldn't trigger mandatory reporting laws in the United States. So that's just basically why I didn't use the full instrument when our adolescent sample.
Dernière question?
J'en ai une.
Oui.
Si je peux. Mathieu Chevalier. I'm a video maker, but I used to study sexology, human sexual science, I guess. Did you survey same-sex couples? And if so, what are your findings? Is it similar to
We
heterosexual
have not surveyed, well, there are a few same-sex couples in this sample, and these data include them, but we had very low rates of same-sex couples participating. I live in a really rural area, and so it's just not a place that is very welcoming necessarily to people in same-sex relationships in a lot of ways, and so I don't think that a lot of people, I don't know, the rates were very low in this sample, but most of the work, there are problems with that too. I think that a lot of the data have the basic problem of not cleaning up what sorts of behaviors that they're talking about. You do see rates that are pretty similar to heterosexual couples in the data that there is in the U.S., but there's not really great data about that. And I think that one of the other problems with these scales that are trying to be universal scales that are sort of like all things to everybody, that there's a lot of issues around same-sex relationships that come out with that. So there are certain kinds of threats, like maybe outing somebody at work, for example, is probably the best known, most commonly used example, that are only going to apply to people in same-sex relationships. But most of the time they leave stuff like that off, because then, again, it becomes complicated to adjust your whole sample when you have questions that not everybody can answer. So there's really a lot of work that's been done that needs to be done in that. The NISVIS sample had some interesting data on same-sex relationships recently that showed that a lot of the victimization by people who identify as lesbian or gay actually came from heterosexual partners. And, you know, and so I think that a lot of time, and that the people who were in that survey, it's a big survey, it's like 16,000 people, and so people who identified as bisexual had higher rates than the people who identified as heterosexual, gay, or lesbian. And there was some question about how that, because some people who eventually identify as gay or lesbian will have a sort of complicated history of trying to developing that sexual identification, and so sometimes they have they identify as lesbian, they might have gone out with men earlier in their life, and it seems like that some of what seems like similar rates among lesbian and gay and heterosexual individuals might really be confounds about like early problematic relationships that may or may not have been with same-sex partners. And so that's sort of an interesting new piece, I think, of sort of teasing out those differences, because that would more map onto, I think, you know, the experience of a lot of people in the gay and lesbian community, that not some of these issues are, some of them are similar, but some of them are different, and I don't think we know enough about how those differences are.
Thank you.
C'est tout pour nous ce matin. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour votre participation.